document, yet there is that strong tendency to rely on what we call secondary literature than primary literature, you know. So I am sure we all have read about or heard about the document Dilexite, but I wonder if we have actually read it. So I confess that at the time that I received the invitation, I had not read it yet myself, no? So what right do I have to even speak to you about mission in the light of a document that I had not yet read myself? I actually even received a copy from Pope Leo at our extraordinary consistory held last January 7 and 8. But I was too busy with a huge bulk of texts to read for the dicastery, for the doctrine of the faith, the Doctrina della Fede, which, as mentioned by Emanuela, I am a member of. I never in my life imagined that one day I would become a member of the Doctrina della Fede, because I was not very positive to this dicastery before, you know. I remember as a student at the Loyola School of Theology, at the start, you know, I was a very young masteral student. I did a thesis on the theology of the ordained ministry according to Edward Schillebeeckx. At the time when Schillebeeckx was being questioned by the Dicastero della Dottrina della Fede, headed by Ratzinger, who would later on become Benedetto, you know, Benedict XVI, who, by the way, appointed me bishop in the year 2006. Yes, so I was not actually very fond of the Doctrina della Fede at the start because I felt like, you know, they were a bit like inquisitors, no? So, so I was busy with a lot of documents because we were going to have a meeting of the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith on January 27 and 28. So in January, I had to go back to Rome 2 times. 7 and 8 for the consistory, and 27, 28 for the Doctrina della Fede, our plenary assembly. And in preparation for that plenary assembly, I had to read a whole bulk of document that thick, you know, so I didn't have time then to read Dilexite, even if Pope Leo himself gave us copies. So thanks to your invitation, you actually forced me to read the text, finally. Sometimes it's good to be invited to give talks like this, because then you're forced really to read. I think the reason I postponed reading the document was because reports had come out that Pope Leo had merely published a document that the late Pope Francis was actually preparing in the last months of his life, but was prevented from finishing because of illness. So I immediately, even with the title, I immediately presupposed that it was following up on Francis's Dilexit Nos, which I was already familiar with. So when Pope Leo, well actually, Pope Leo mentions that in the very first paragraph of Dilexite. When Pope Leo learned that his predecessor had intended this unpublished document to be a sequel to Dilexit Nos, in the same way Laudate Deum was a sequel to Laudato Si, Leo assumed the responsibility of finalizing the text, finalizing the draft, and publishing it in his name. And I like the way popes do that with each other's ideas and thoughts, because Francis also did that with Pope Benedict. Some of you might remember that Pope Francis did the same thing with an unpublished writing of Pope Benedict when he took over the papacy. He saw a whole draft that Pope Benedict was preparing, and he published it and entitled it Lumen Fidei, the light of faith. Lumen Fidei is Benedict, published by Francis and redacted by Francis, just as Dilexite is Francis, but redacted and published by Leo. Well, something inside me was saying that if this document were something like Deus Caritas Est, what Deus Caritas Est for Benedict, or what Evangelii Gaudium was for Pope Francis, well, if this were touted to contain Pope Leo's program of papacy, because when you think of Benedict, you think of Deus Caritas Est. When you think of Francis, you think of Evangelii Gaudium. You call it the typical program of papacy of a pope who is beginning with his ministry as Bishop of Rome and as leader of the Universal Catholic Church, a symbol of Petrine communion. So I've been waiting for that. I've been eagerly waiting for a document that would be presented as the program of papacy of Leo XIV. During the conclave, there was one opportunity at coffee break when I found myself sitting next to Robert Prevost. We were having coffee. He looked at me and said, "Viene de qué paese?" I said, "Filippine." LA? I asked him. He said, "Peru." He introduced himself as a Peruvian. And so I switched to Espanol. I said, "Entonces usted habla español muy bien." And he looked at me and smiled and said, "Oh, you're a Filipino. You must speak good English." I said, "Oh, thank God." So I said, Peruvian and speaking good English. I said, "No, I'm also American," he said. So we now have a pope who identifies himself more as a Peruvian than an American. Actually, a Peruvian is an American, South American. The problem is America has been appropriated by the United States of America, as if the United States is the whole of America. Well, he was never seen in the company of the American cardinals. I don't know why, but they always stuck together. Cardinal Dolan, all the other American cardinals, they always came together. They were transported by a vehicle from the North American College, But Prevost was never seen in their company. So we did not really know he was American until later on we interacted with one another. So, yeah. Where's my text? Yes. So, I have been waiting, like I said, for a text from Prevost that would give me an idea how he intends to lead the Catholic Church. And we're waiting very eagerly for that. If you are already familiar with the final document of the Synod on Synodality, which unfortunately has been so identified with Pope Francis, such that some people think that because Pope Francis has passed on already, the synodality project is over already. But it is an unfinished thing because we have a preparation for a General Ecclesial Assembly in 2028, which is going to be the first of its kind and supposed to be a byproduct of that synod on synodality. That's why it was very important for many of us in the College of Cardinals to emphasize that synodality is not Pope Francis. That we took synodality very seriously because for us, it was Vatican II. That Vatican II was a work in progress and that there was a tendency to forget it, you know, and that Pope Francis sort of put us back in focus. That's why his point of reference was Lumen Gentium. So, I'd say, maybe we should stop equating synodality with Pope Francis. So if you are familiar with the final document of the Synod on Synodality by now, I would presuppose that you know that mission was integral to the agenda of Pope Francis in pushing for a more synodal church. You cannot speak of a synodal church and not speak of mission at the same time. He made it very clear already in Evangelii Gaudium that his objective was how to propel the church from maintenance mode to mission mode. Church from maintenance to mission. And you know that the pre-conclave speech of Bergoglio before he became Pope Francis leaked in the media. And it wasn't supposed to be because there was supposed to be confidentiality in our discussions. But somehow it leaked through Cardinal Ortega of Cuba. Because apparently he was so impressed by that 3-minute speech of Bergoglio at the pre-conclave discussion, he asked for a copy. And Bergoglio said it was spontaneous. And Ortega said, "Can you write it down for me?" And he obliged. He wrote it down. And he gave it to Ortega. But Ortega sent it to his director for social communications, who published it in the social media. And it was circulating already by the time that Pope Francis became Pope. That Bergoglio became Pope Francis. And the one who picked it up and brought it to my attention was my brother, the sociologist, Randy David. You know, who is eagerly reading theology also and a lot of material about the church from the sociological perspective. And I know that many of you Italian missionaries are reading my brother because I heard that from the Pime fathers who actually invited my brother to address them. You might want to invite him one of these days. You know, he's a very interesting person, you know. But he's getting old already. He's 80 years old, you know. But still, you know, teaching and very sharp, yeah. So Randy David asked me, he said, "I don't trust the social media. I know there's a lot of disinformation there. And this material is attributed to Bergoglio. Would you be able to check for me if this indeed might be Bergoglio?" And I did. So what I did, I went back to Aparecida, because I heard that Bergoglio practically put his signature on one important document of CELAM, the Conferencias Episcopales Latinoamericanos in Madagascar of Latin America. And I followed the Latin American documents very closely. And I've always been interested in the output of the Latin American church after liberation theology and all that, no? So there's been a very close interaction between Latin American theology and Asian and African theology, the global South, you know. Yeah. And I did. And you know that my area of expertise is reduction criticism, you know. So noon biblista, I was a professor of Pentateuch and Prophets in the Loyola School of Theology for 17 years before I was made a bishop. So I work with texts. So it is easy for me to read a text and with just a little research, you know, to sort of dismantle the text and say, you know, I see the hand of somebody, of this author here. And I confirmed that it really came from Bergoglio. And that would be validated later on by Evangelii Gaudium. Everything that he said in that alleged 3-minute speech is suddenly there in Evangelii Gaudium. You know what he said about Christ is knocking at the door. You know, and it's funny because he is quoting that from Porta Fidei, written by Pope Benedict. You remember the year of faith that was declared by Pope Benedict and the apostolic letter that accompanied it, Porta Fidei? And then there Pope Benedict says, the door of faith is always open, you know. And Pope Francis is reacting to it. It is not open. In many parts of the world, the door of faith is closing down. People are not that receptive to faith, especially in the context of secularism. So, Pope Francis, you know, picked up the quotation of Benedict from Revelations chapter 3. Here I am knocking at the door. If you open up, I will enter and have dinner with you. If you open up. The Lord is knocking. And then Pope Francis surprised his fellow cardinals when he quoted that and gave it a different sense. And he said, yes, the Lord is knocking at the door. Not from outside, but from inside. He's not knocking at the door to enter the church. He is knocking at the door to get out of the church because we keep him in the safe confines of our church. And then he says, that's the problem with the church. We are becoming self-referential, too parochial, too concerned with our little churchy issues. That's why we have no impact on the world. Whatever happened to mission? So he says, we have to go out, go out. And that was his challenge to the Filipinos when he visited us in the year 2015, who were here already in 2015. Yeah. You remember that speech that he delivered in Luneta? Go out, he said, go out to the peripheries, to the existential peripheries. And Cardinal Tagle made a joke about that. You know, in his speech, Cardinal Tagle said to Pope Francis, Holy Father, thank you for the challenge that you posed to the Filipinos to go out to the peripheries. The Filipinos were not familiar with the vocabulary peripheries at the start, you know. What is that, peripheries? It's like, most Filipinos are English-speaking, but that term was not very familiar to most. We'd rather use margins, you know, the margins of society, but he used peripheries. Yeah. How would you say that in Italian? Periferia, okay. So, yeah, we became familiar suddenly with the term peripheries. Yeah, to go out to the peripheries. And yes, that's the challenge of the Synod on Synodality. Pope Francis made it very clear already in Evangelii Gaudium was that his objective was to propel the church in mission. That in general, we tend to be satisfied or complacent with the church on maintenance mode. And that is how it goes even in the Philippines. With most of our parishes, they are on maintenance mode. They're okay. You know, they're still very functional. But they're old and tired institutions. They need some freshness, you know. They need to be challenged. And you know how it is in the Philippines. We love to say a lot of people come to church. But if you think of the population of Catholics in this country, it's not true. A minority of people come to church. It's not because they don't want to come to church. Our churches are too small. Like the Cathedral Church in Caloocan City, it can accommodate only 800 people. So we have to celebrate about 10 times on Sunday to be able to accommodate even just 10% of our cathedral parishioners. So what happens to the rest of them? So, it says, I don't, you know, I'm not saying I feel sorry that the 90% or the majority are not coming to church. It's the fact is, we're unable to. They keep saying there are a lot of priests in the Philippines. It's not true. I think you, our partners in mission, are discovering how the larger percentage of Filipino Catholics are not really spiritually and pastorally cared for. That's why there is a kind of myth. And sometimes when I encounter bishops abroad, they say, send us more priests, send us more priests. I said, what do you mean? We don't even have enough. Caloocan City, how many priests do I have? Only 35. I have 1.8 million Catholics. What is that? So I need the help of the religious. That's why half of my priests in Caloocan are religious. And I had to open mission stations inviting even women religious to lead Christian communities in the mission stations, you know. Because I don't think the work of the priests is enough. And in general, you know, I'm surprised that sometimes women are better community organizers of basic ecclesial communities than the men or than the priests. The priests are too busy with sacramental duties. Yeah. So, Pope Francis made it clear, no? And my first instinct, the moment I read the topic you assigned to me, was to ask, what could it be that is motivating you to ask about the challenges and opportunities for mission? And in the light of Pope Leo's first document, which bridges his papacy with that of Pope Francis. How nice, no? In the same way that Lumen Fidei bridged Pope Benedict and Pope Francis, Dilexite is bridging Pope Francis with Pope Leo. I am aware that many missionary congregations are not only in a maintenance mode, but some of them are even in a crisis mode. Because the well springs of religious vocations are drying up. Especially vocations to the religious life in congregations established in Europe which are also aging and drying up. And it is precisely in response to the crisis that Pope Francis challenged the Church through the Synod on Synodality to put mission back in its proper context. The proper context of mission is the Church's very modus vivendi et operandi, which is the concern of synodality. Thank you, sister. Last February, after our plenary assembly in the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith, I went to Belgium upon invitation of some groups there. So I was invited to give a theological lecture at the Faculty of Theology of the Katholieke Universiteit te Leuven. That's my alma mater, where I did my licentiate and doctorate in biblical studies. And then I was also invited by another group, an institution called Curando, which I did not know very much about. But it was a wonderful experience for me, because it was an association of lay collaborators of the religious, lay collaborators who have taken over the charism of the religious who have formed them. It was very interesting. And I am talking about a little congregation called the Sisters of Our Lady of the Seven Sorrows of the Blessed Mother, established in Belgium in 1668. So they existed for many centuries, and their main work was really focused on the care for the sick and the elderly. And these sisters, the congregation is about to die, because the last remaining sisters are only 15, aged between 90 to 100. And they are all living in the home for the elderly established by them. But the homes for the elderly established by them, instead of closing down, are multiplying. And the ministry, the charism established by the sisters, is very much alive. It has been reinvented by the lay collaborators. And now they're going all around West Flanders, extending even to Wallonia, and very successful and very deeply committed. And yet these are lay people, married, celibates, and involved in the world, but very committed to their sense of mission in an institution they established and they called Curando. And I dialogued with them, and they're a little bit concerned that all of it happened very informally, and the properties of the congregation have not been properly passed on to them. But they are managing it for the sisters as long as the sisters are alive. But what happens when they die? And they're afraid that the state might take over and simply confiscate everything. I said, there is something you can do. We can have you canonically recognized by Rome as an ecclesial family. I don't know if you've heard of that new canonical entity called ecclesial family. And they're growing anywhere in different parts of the world. But most of them began with the work of religious congregations that have aged and are passing away, but taking new forms in the work of their lay collaborators. And they were surprised that there was such a possibility. And I wish that it would materialize. Because the institutions that they've established are non-profit care organizations focused on. young nurses in Belgium, they reached out to the Philippines, to two institutions, St. Mary's University in Bayumbong, Nueva Vizcaya, and Assumption University in Pampanga, San Fernando. For what? Well, in order to be able to train nurses and caregivers for curando from the Philippines. And what they did was they partnered with the School for Nursing, and they were able to get, some of these students to volunteer, but they start with the charism of curando. It's not an invitation for people to migrate or to find job, but more to share in our mission, curando. So they have to start by embracing the vision and mission of their institution. And then they are given a basic education on Belgian culture and the Flemish language. And I met there 7 Filipino caregivers. They had just arrived a month before that. But I was amazed that they were speaking fluent Flemish to the elderly people. I said, "Where did you learn that?" And they said, "In the Philippines." Already in the Philippines, they had been prepared not for a job, but for participation in a mission. And they were very excited about it. I said, "Something's wonderful about this," I said. Because on the one hand, you see something very sad, a congregation dying. On the other hand, you see something beautiful. The mission thriving, flourishing, taken over by people who totally believe in the charism left to them by the sisters. You know how it is even in the Philippines. It's the same. I was just with the ICM sisters 2 days ago, and they were all in wheelchairs. This was one of the most vibrant congregations in the Philippines, begun by Belgian missionaries, Zusters Bandiyak, And then, very close to this place, the Good Shepherd sisters. They don't have vocations anymore. But the work that they've begun, the different ministries that they've started, continue to be alive in their collaborators. And how I wish they could produce something similar to the Corando institution that I was telling you about. So before we understand mission as an activity, it is important to understand it first as a way of being that is integral to being church. A way of being integral to being church. Let me explain a bit more. Because in the light of the call for a more synodal church, mission is no longer to be understood as just the task of a few missionary congregations. It is the mandate of the whole church. That is the point of Pope Francis. That the whole church is called to be missionary. So you don't relegate mission only to a few missionary congregations. Something's wrong about that. The whole church must be a missionary church. And that's the reason why I've been opening mission stations in my diocese. We already have opened 20 mission stations. The Italian Pime fathers are running one of them. They call it the Virgin of the Poor mission station in Tansa, in Navotas. And these are inserted communities in the slum communities. Yeah. But we make it clear to our mission partners that we're not sending them there to engage in a mission. We're sending them there so that the parish which that mission station belongs to could participate in the mission. How to propel a parochial church, because a parochial church is on maintenance mode. A parochial church will cater only to those who come to church. That's the common tendency in the Philippines. The priests wait in their conventos because there are enough people who come to church. Instead of going out, they wait for them to come. And even just serving those who come to church, they're already very busy. So you don't expect them to go out anymore. They will complain. That's why I say, okay, no problem. I will not ask you to go out if you have enough work just attending to the people who come to church. But I'll give you collaborators who will work with you. But who will make sure that now your whole parish community can be nurtured in the spirit of mission. That they will participate. And I was very happy one time when I celebrated the sacrament of confirmation in one of the biggest slums in Malabon, in Lettre. I was in the middle of a talipapa. Yeah? So it's like you had to go through the narrow alleys of the slum communities, and then in the middle there is a little basketball court next to the estero, and then there is a wet market, right next. And what the community did was they turned the basketball place into an instant cathedral. I went there, and I was surprised. They were prepared. And they had an altar there. They have a lectern there. They, the kids were well dressed. And there was a choir. There were even risers, I had the altar servers. I had lectors. I had acolytes, And it was like I was celebrating Mass in a regular cathedral, except that I was in the middle of the talipapa. And so I was amazed. And so I talked to the mission chaplain. I said, Father, I said, where did you get all of these volunteers for these ministries? I said, and he said, did you borrow them from the parish? He said, no, Bishop, these are ours. I said, oh, so you also have your own catechists and all other ministries in the mission station? Yes, Bishop. And who trained them? The parish. So he linked up with the parish so that he could invite all the different ministries to train volunteers in the slum community. And it was the first time that altar servers entered the slums. You see, it's like that. There is always a big gap between the rich and the poor in the Philippines. And most of these kids were comfortable kids serving in the cathedral church, And now, through the invitation of the mission chaplain, these cathedral altar servers, with permission from their parents, were allowed to go out and to train their fellow children from the poorest of the poor. So, who is engaging in mission? Not just the chaplain, but those kids who have served the parish community. Now they felt they're participating in mission. And it happened with all the other volunteers for the ministries. So it's like a whole parish community participating in mission, going out to the periphery. Because in Metro Manila, it is like that. There is an alienation between the original residents and the local migrants. Migration in the Philippines comes on two levels. People know only of foreign migration from the Philippines to different parts of the world, diaspora. No. It begins with local migration. People looking for jobs. They could not find opportunities in the country, in the provinces. I am sure you've had that experience in Italy also. Your experience is our experience. Because there's also the Italian diaspora. And you have been spread also in different parts of the world. You have Italians in Argentina. You have Italians in Peru, you know. You have Italians in different parts of the world. And what brought that about? Well, many times poverty. But before some of your fellow Italians found their way to the United States or in Mexico or Argentina, first they migrated to the cities, looking for jobs. And then when they earned enough, they migrated abroad. Same pattern with Filipinos. So imagine Caloocan, Malabon, and Navotas. And you have traditional parishes that are very small communities actually. Like, let's say, San Antonio de Padua Parish in Tonsuya, Malabon. That community is only about 10,000 people. Suddenly, it was surrounded by slums, squatters' areas. And one squatter area belonging to that parish, like Katmon, has 60,000 people, more than the parish itself, and no contact with the parish. Because they're migrants. You don't presuppose that just because they're all Filipinos and they're all Catholics, they'll feel comfortable entering the church. No. They're alienated. Yeah. So nothing will happen about spiritual and pastoral care if nobody comes out from the parish. Yeah. So, that's it. So before we understand it as an activity, mission, you know, we have to understand it as first as a way of being, integral to being church. So, let me now zero in on Dilexite and the image of a listening church. A listening church. How it bridges Pope Francis and Pope Leo. You know, in the past few months, I have had several moments of close encounters with Pope Leo XIV. Not just formal encounters, but moments that revealed something of what I believe to be his pastoral instinct. What struck me most was not what he said, but how he listened. He speaks very sensibly, but my impression is it's because he listens attentively. There was a certain unhurried attentiveness, what you'd call un ascolto vero, as if each voice carried a weight. I saw it at the Jubilee for the Synodal Teams last October in Rome, when he listened to 7 continental reports, and he had a notebook, and he was noting what he was hearing. And then later, when given the opportunity, he responded spontaneously, picking up from what each of the 7 continents said. It was beautiful. He listened very attentively. When we had a meeting with him, first meeting with him in the Synod Council, you know that there is the General Secretariat for the Synod of Bishops, and there is a council that advises that General Secretariat with representatives from the different continents. And Cardinal Filippine of Goa and myself are the Asian delegates. So, during our encounter with him, I don't know what got to Cardinal Mario Greco of Malta. He probably got a bit excited about this first encounter with Pope Leo. He said, why don't we change the pattern and then start with the first 30 minutes of our encounter, immediately with an open forum. And then the second part would be the reporting of the continent's representatives of the Synod Council to Pope Leo. Okay, Pope Leo said, suit yourself, whatever you wish. So, when Cardinal Grech said, any questions from the Synod Council? A lot of people raised their hands. And one after the other, they posed questions to Pope Leo, and most of them were hot-button questions. Very critical questions. Instead of immediately answering each question, after listening to one question, said, next question, please. No answer. And then next question, please, And then he just listened to all the questions without answering them. And then, after listening to all the questions, he looked at us. He smiled. And then he raised his notebook and his pen. And he said, look, I came here to listen to you because you are my synodal council. And I suppose that's what the council is for consultation. I'm here to consult you. But you're asking me questions as if you're expecting me to answer all of those questions. Whatever happened to synodality, he said. I do not intend to lead like a lone ranger, he said. And that made everybody laugh. I don't know if you're familiar with that old movie, The Lone Ranger, Does it have an Italian equivalent? Lone Ranger. How do you say that in Italian? A Lone Ranger.
Ranger solitario.
Oh, Ranger solitario, okay. Yes. So he said, I don't intend to be a Lone Ranger. But beneath the humor, there was something I felt was serious. It was a quiet correction of a model of leadership that undermines not only collegiality, but also co-responsibility in mission. And sometimes there is so much of that kind of brand of leadership where the pastoral plan is done by the pastor, not by the community. And perhaps that is where mission must begin. Not from control, but from listening. Ascoltare con il cuore. Listening not only to each other, but more importantly, listening to the Holy Spirit through each other. Which is, consistently being emphasized by synodality. Through the discipline called conversations in the Spirit. And I hope, you've learned to practice what we call conversations in the Spirit. Because there is a discipline to it. It's not just a routine. And there is a reason why the first round in the conversation is not about it is not going to be about your reaction to anything. It has to be something you own. And then there is a time for preparation. Because one of the bad habits of conversation is somebody is talking and you are already preparing what to answer. So you end up not listening. And then you react, but your reaction is not coming from what you heard. So it's very common. It means there is no conversation. There is monologue, not dialogue. That's why the conversation in the Spirit is a discipline for attentive listening. Because the reaction to what others said would be already the second round. And in the third round, you are already identifying building blocks, the points of convergence, even while you acknowledge the points of divergence. If there are divergences, that could only mean we need more conversations. It's like building consensus, and believe me, it works. Especially if it is done in the spirit of prayer. But I have been experimenting on doing it with civil society organizations. Lately, because of the flood control corruption scandal in the Philippines, I've been closely in touch with civil society groups. Even the opposition. It's like, you know that one of our problems is we do not yet have a common standard bearer in the opposition. And I introduced synodality so that they could talk with each other. Facilitated conversation in the spirit with rules. Yeah? And the rules have to do with discernment. That's why the listening has to be attentive. Because we don't just listen to each other, we listen to the Spirit through each other. Well, this is one of the major challenges to the church. The fact that, in general, because we tend to equate our mission with proclaiming the gospel, we are more accustomed to being listened to more than to listen. Because, obviously people if you say, how do you feel about this? In general, in the Philippines, if it is a priest asking, lay people would say, it's up to you, Father. What about you? Just tell us what to do. Because they're used to being told. They're programmed to listening and not being listened to. So when suddenly they're being listened to, they don't know how to behave. Because they're not used to listening leaders. So, I remember in my younger years, the evangelicals and Pentecostals popularized the campus crusade for Christ in universities. And they popularized a slogan. The slogan was, Christ is the answer! Exclamation point. Christ is the answer. And we always saw posters everywhere. Christ is the answer. One day, one student wrote a reaction right below the poster. What was the question? We in the Catholic Church have actually been just as guilty as the evangelicals and Pentecostals in quickly offering faith as an answer without even bothering to listen to people's questions. The former Superior General of the SVDs was a Filipino, Tony Pernia. He was there with us in the Synod on the Word of God in 2008, the first synod I ever attended as a very young bishop. And, he delivered a brief intervention that lingered in the minds of the synod delegates. He said, as a congregation immersed in the real-life conditions of the poor in our country, I have come to the realization that one of the most important contributions that we religious could make to the church is to serve as a hearing aid. How do you say hearing aid in Italian? Auriculare, yes. So that little contraption that you put in the ear, in order to amplify the voices that you hear. And it was funny that he said the religious, they serve as a hearing aid for the church. And of course, everybody laughed because it presupposes that the church is suffering from deafness and needs a hearing aid. And I think he was correct. Maybe we're not listening. We're more used to being listened to than listening. Okay, let me now refer you to the text of the Emmaus narrative. The Emmaus narrative, Luke chapter 24, 13 to 36. A favorite of the Synod on Synodality. A key text. You remember that stranger who walked with the two disciples and what he did when he walked with them. It's a beautiful template or pattern for missionary activity. Why? 5 steps. First, he drew near and walked with them, which is the first step to mission. Not to do anything, not to say anything, but to draw near to the lives of people, to walk with people, to live with people. The second thing that he did was he began to enter into their conversation, not by immediately teaching, but by listening attentively to their story. He just started with a question. You seem to be engaged in a lively conversation. What is it that you are passionate about? And they looked at him and they said, are you the only guy in the whole of Jerusalem who do not know what is the tragic things that have happened there in the past few days? And the stranger said, what things? And then they told the story. And he listened. And the funny thing is, they don't know it's Jesus they're talking to. They tell the story of Jesus to Jesus. But they tell the story of Jesus as a tragic story. And Jesus painfully listens to the tragic story. I tell you, many people in the mission will tell you tragic stories of their lives. He listened. Third step, after listening, he retold their story. The retelling of the story. But this time no longer as a tragic story, but a story of redemption. How does he do it? He helps them reimagine their Jerusalem experience in the light of the Scriptures. In the light of the Scriptures. And sometimes I react to the translation that says, and he interpreted the Scriptures for them. It's like he spoke like a Bible exegete. He interpreted the Scriptures. No. He interpreted experience in the light of the Scriptures. He interpreted an experience that was tragic, traumatic, and meaningless as far as these two disciples were concerned. But when he retold the story in the light of the Scriptures, it became a story of redemption. Fourth step, he stayed with them to break bread with them. Aren't these the steps of mission? Drawing near and walking with, entering into people's conversations, but first listening attentively, even to their tragic stories. And third step, retelling, helping them look at their stories, but in the light of the Scriptures. And fourthly, staying with them and breaking bread with them. And the last stage is the most important work of the missionary. He disappeared. Well, some missionaries don't know how to disappear anymore. Yeah, sometimes we make ourselves so indispensable as if everything will fall apart if we leave. No, we have to know when to leave. Missionaries, they're comfortable about disappearing. They can go. They're not indispensable. This is not your job. It was Jesus at work. We're just participants in the work. So I find those 5 steps very, very beautiful, important. So he vanished from their sight only after getting them to recognize him in the breaking of the bread. Yeah, maybe that's why we say, this is my body. You know, it's like you look at the bread and you recognize him. In the bread, taken, blessed, broken, and shared, you recognize him. So let's zero in now on the message that grounds everything, which is, I have loved you. I've loved you. And I'm going so slowly that I noticed that I've used up my time already. Can I still have about 15 minutes and then leave the rest of the 15 minutes for interaction? Is that okay? Yeah. If you need toilet break, don't hesitate to just stand and go. Yeah. So, Tio amato, dilexite. Yeah. It's not Vio amato, but Tio amato. It's personal. It's first person addressing to a second person. The document opens with these words drawn from the scripture. Not a command, not a strategy, not even a teaching, but a declaration. I have loved you. And it is drawn from Revelations chapter 3, verse 9. And it is addressed to a community described in very simple terms by the writer. Of course, we're talking about the same one who wrote the 4th gospel, but who seems to me to be more advanced in years by now. I imagine the writer of Revelation to be the same person, but quite old already. He follows a literary genre that I am familiar with personally because I wrote my doctoral dissertation on Daniel. So I am familiar with apocalyptic literature. And I defended my dissertation at the same time that Mount Pinatubo was erupting in Pampanga. And my mother spoke about it as an apocalyptic experience, you know. She thought it was the end of the world. We tend to be apocalyptic every now and then, you know. Apocalypticism and eschatology are so closely related to each other. So, the literary form is apocalyptic. And when you're dealing with an apocalyptic literary form, the pattern is the same. There is always a vision or a dream and an interpretation. That's how it goes, let's say, in the book of Daniel. Yeah? Daniel is a visionary. He dreams, and then, in the first part, somebody dreams and Daniel interprets. In the second part, Daniel is the dreamer and an angel interprets. And John is following that second part of Daniel, the pattern of him having a vision or a dream, and then an angelic image, an angelic character will do the interpreting. One of my favorite angels is Gabriel, because I think that's the role of Gabriel. Gabriel is an angel interpreter. He is the exegete. He is the expert in hermeneutics, you know. The angel Gabriel is not a creation of New Testament. He's very Old Testament. He is in the book of Daniel. He's actually intertestamental, you know. Like Daniel has he is studying the scriptures in chapter 9. And he reads the line from the book of Jeremiah about 70 years. And 17 years before the end of the exile. And Daniel could not understand the biblical passage that he had read. And he prays. And the angel Gabriel comes in and he says, Daniel, beloved of God, the Lord has heard your prayer. You're struggling with a biblical passage you cannot understand. I am here to interpret it for you, you know. I like that role of the angel as an interpreter. Someone who helps somebody struggling for meaning about something he cannot understand. So, in Revelation 3 verse 9, that's where we quote, Dilexite, I have loved you. I. And who is I? Obviously, it is the author himself, John. But, daring to speak to the 7 churches in the name of Christ. So the I is Christ. The I is Christ and the I is John. Just as the missionary is Christ and the missionary is you. Christ and the missionary. Because he says, as the Father has sent me, so I send you. The unity between the sender and the one being sent. Because the one being sent represents the sender. You don't substitute, you represent. That ministry of representation is so important. But you know, to understand this, we have to start from the beginning of the book, the opening verse of Revelations, chapter 1, verse 1, where the opening line says, the revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave to him. And he's talking about the writer. God gave to him to show his servants what is going to happen soon. He made it known by sending his angel to his servant John. So John is having a vision, and the angel will interpret the vision. In short, it is Jesus who speaks to John, according to John. And in a vision which an angel is interpreting for him. You know, I always experience that myself because every day I engage in a routine early in the morning, which I call Coffee with Jesus. That's something I cannot do without anymore. And since I was made a bishop and was given so many responsibilities, my Coffee with Jesus started getting a bit longer. It used to be only about 45 minutes, it reached to 1 hour, and now it's at least 2 hours. At least. It's like I'm not doing it as an obligation or a rule, but something I need to survive. Coffee with Jesus, a daily exercise of listening to Jesus in prayer and meditation on the scriptures. And always, intimately, reminding Jesus that people come to church to listen to him, not to me. And I said, Jesus, how can you forsake your people? I'll be celebrating Mass in a while, and people would come. They're not interested in what I have to say. They're waiting for you to speak to them through me. So you better tell me what you want to say to them. So I find myself also switching from the third person to the first person in my homilies. Daring to speak in Jesus' name, believing that we are called not just to agere in persona Christi, and by the way, that's not exclusive to the ordained, because we all receive the same Spirit, part of the body of Christ. So it's not true that agere in persona Christi is a monopoly of the ordained. the headship, well, the participation of the ordained in the body of Christ is very specific. But it doesn't mean you don't have a body. I mean, you don't have the whole body if it's just a head. It's head and body together. So it's the whole body that represents Christ. And it's St. Augustine who kept insisting on that. Taught the call to mission is not just agere in persona Christi for the whole body of Christ, but also loqui in persona Christi, to speak in the name of Christ. And this is exactly what the evangelist is doing in the fourth gospel. He makes Jesus speak in the first person. And this used to make me uneasy because it made Jesus sound like an arrogant Superman. I don't know if you've ever felt that. When I was a much younger student of theology, I reacted whenever I heard Jesus saying, I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the resurrection. I am the good shepherd. That's why you don't blame Apollo Kiboloy. You know Kiboloy? Yeah. I am the Son of God. He says, I am the anointed Son of God, He is mimicking Jesus. As if Jesus really spoke that way. He doesn't know how to do exegesis. He doesn't know that John is using a kind of literary genre. But look at the synoptics. You never hear Jesus talking like that. You will never hear Jesus saying, I am the vine, you are the branches, But if you're a normal human being, and you presuppose that Jesus is also a normal human being, because he's true God and true man, you would be scandalized by the way he talks in John. So I used to be scandalized by the I am passages. I didn't understand at the start. Why is Jesus talking like that? Now, I have a feeling that the fourth gospel had an earlier layer that consisted of a catechetical instruction for catechumens, with the evangelist explaining to his community of believers in the third person who Jesus is for him, using a series of Christological statements. Because the objective of each gospel is Christological. Same with Matthew, Mark, and Luke. How this Jesus whom they followed is the Christ, the Son of God. That's Christology. Now, John is also doing Christology. But he's going to shift from third person to first person. From who Jesus is for him to who Jesus says he is. If you put it in the third person, I think John was catechizing the members of the Johannine community. And he was instructing them that this Jesus they had followed was the bread of life. That he was the light of the world. That he is the gate of the sheepfold. That he is the good shepherd. That he is the resurrection. That in him they found the way, the truth, and the life. That he is the vine. We have to be connected to him. Very much like Pope Francis's Dilexit Nos, third person. He loved us. Which Pope Leo now switches to Dilexite. I have loved you. From third person to first person. I call that the symbolic switch that every missionary must experience. From a third person Christ to a first person Christ in you. Christ in us, says St. Paul, the hope of glory, Christ in us. You see, in the fourth gospel, I see a redactional development in which John is also switching from the third person to the first person, from He is to I am, as a deliberate allusion to God's self-identification to Moses in the book of Exodus. Remember, Moses said to God, "If they ask me what your name is, what will I say to them?" And the Lord said, "Tell them, I am sent you to them." Ego eimi. Io sono. I am. That's the name of God. Not I was, not I will be, but I am. The great I am. And that's why John switches from the third person catechetical statements about Jesus to first person statements. It is the Lord who speaks. I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am the gate for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I am the resurrection. By putting them in first person, he cleverly succeeds in echoing the divine name, I am, and communicates his kerygma. The kerygma, the proclamation, is the divine identity of Jesus. And I have a feeling that the switch happens only after he composes his apocalyptic book, the book of Revelations. I am sorry. So I've reached the end of my time. I will just share the rest of my text to you. You will have time to read the rest of it. I've already delivered about 75% of it. So you can just read through the rest of it. I would like to give you a little bit of time before your break at 10 o'clock for a bit of interaction if you want that. I did not finish the point about Revelations 3 verse 9 because Revelations 3 verse 9 starts in verse 8 with that line where the Lord says, "You have but little power." And he's talking to a marginal community. A community with not much resources, not much power, no influence. And his message to them is, you are regarded by nobodies by the world, but I have loved you. That's the beginning of empowerment for mission. Hai poca forza, ma ti ho amato. You are nobody, you have little power, but I have loved you. That's the basis for mission. First, recognition of our littleness, but in our littleness, how we are empowered because of love, because of the love of Christ. Okay, let me end that there. Thank you.
Question is, we, especially as religious and the priest mainly, are always being trained and feel that we are called to bring Jesus to people. But we have never been trained or prepared that we don't go to bring Jesus because Jesus is already there. And how can I learn to see Jesus there and learn from Jesus what my contribution Jesus wants me to give in order to make his presence more real? So a shift from a more, let us say, from pastoral to more spiritual way. If you can combine these three questions into some.
Well, I'll probably start immediately with the third question, because we really tend to be triumphalistic, in our mission. Really, the idea is to bring Jesus, to bring Jesus. Yes, we are inheriting templates for mission. And we have to be critical also with the templates for mission that we have inherited, but we need not be too judgmental because that's what they knew back then. That's what they thought was best to do, Yeah. When I think of the colonial periods, I think of how, for example, missionaries rowed the galleons of the conquistadores and ended up being instruments of colonialism, with the exception of a few Italians like Matteo Ricci, like Alessandro Valignani. And I was surprised. It was, the Pime father, Gianni Criveler, who introduced me to Matteo Ricci, and I read his writings. I was very fascinated by this man. He avoided his fellow Jesuits in the Philippines, who were Spanish Jesuits. They did not see eye to eye, the Italian Jesuits and the Spanish Jesuits. And you know what Matteo Ricci was saying? He said, I will, even if they are my confreres, I think they have gotten addicted already by the Patronato Real, because of all the political and economic support that they're getting from the colonial regime, and they're very comfortable with it, He said, I would like to avoid that template of mission. And so he went to China and became Chinese with the Chinese, And it's amazing how much deeper the impact was on China. And up to now, he's still remembered. The same with Alessandro Valignani, And to my surprise, they're Italians. And I realized that it was for that purpose that the Propaganda Fide had been established, precisely to separate the mission from the politics, colonial politics of the Patronato Real. And it was an excellent move. That's why they came up with the, pontifical missions, pontifical mission societies, because they were aware that something had gone wrong with the patterns of mission. Yeah, that kind of paternalism, really, patronizing the poor. And actually the rest of the talk will zero in on that, where Pope Leo speaks about, he reminds us that in recognizing Christ in the poor and the suffering, we encounter the very heart of Christ himself. That's why he says, mission does not begin with preoccupation with expansion. Actually, that preoccupation happens when we develop messianic complex. That we come in like the Savior. I'm here to save you. You remember the surprise of the one who thinks he was saving the poor? When the Lord said to him, come in, I was hungry, you gave me food. I was thirsty, you gave me drink. I was naked, you clothed me. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. And he is surprised and he said, when, Lord? When did it happen? That that you were hungry, thirsty, naked, a stranger, sick, and I cared for you. When? And he said, as often as you did it to the least of my brothers and sisters, you did it for me. The scandal there is the equation between Christ and the poor. You thought you were saving the poor were saving you. Restoring your humanity. That is why God always speaks like the God who feels the suffering of the poor. Remember what he said to Moses? Moses, I have seen the affliction of my people. I have heard their cry. I know well their suffering. I have come down. So please, may I send you to them. So, Moses, when he was in Midian, he was running away like the disciples at Emmaus. He was running away, only to be confronted by the burning bush. And the burning bush was familiar to Moses because he had seen it before, not outside but inside. That's the reason why he left Egypt. Something was burning inside him. He couldn't understand why he felt pain whenever he saw the sufferings of those who suffered. He ran away from it. And only to be confronted by God, who says, are you suffering because people suffer? So am I. What you feel is what I feel. It's the suffering of the divine in the poor, you know. And that equation is very biblical. Old Testament, New Testament. The God who identifies with the poor. So the poor are not to be patronized as just beneficiaries of our charity. And some time ago, I was invited by the clergy of Bayombong in Nueva Vizcaya, where the Belgian fathers established their first missions. And now everything has been turned over to the diocesans because there are no more Belgian fathers and they have less vocations. And good thing, you know, there are now the diocesan priests to take over. But they were having a discussion about new assignments. And some of the old Belgian missions were being passed on to diocesan priests. And they were crying. The diocesan priests refused to accept being assigned in a former Belgian mission. And I was surprised and said, I have just visited one of these Belgian parishes established by Belgian missionaries, big churches, big schools, big, you know, conventos. I said, why? Why would these are beautifully established communities? And they said, we have a very bad image with them. Because the people, they always say, oh, the missionaries, they come to give us something. The diocesans, they ask for money. And I said, how can you serve a community that would not even participate in the resources of the community? Because they were conditioned to be beneficiaries of charity. So apparently, many of these missionaries, they had contacts abroad. And if they needed a church, they got money from abroad and built the church. If they needed a school, they got money from abroad and built the school. And the people were used to receiving all of these good things from abroad. And they were conditioned for that, as beneficiaries, not as participants in the life and mission of the church. It sounds good, but it is not good. Because it's paternalistic, it's patronizing. They never grow, they never mature. So, we said, they were crying, pleading with the bishop not to be assigned there because they have such a bad reputation. It's like, we don't like diocesan priests. We want foreign missionaries because they give us something. And I'm happy to listen to those questions because they're coming already from a different perspective of mission. Obviously. Meaning, you have come of age already as missionaries. And you're coming into a Philippine church, which really is very paternalistic. A Philippine church where, we're so presumptuous of the power and authority, you know. And I'm trying to understand it myself, you know. I'm glad that I was assigned to Caloocan. I would not be happy being assigned to Manila or Cebu. In fact, I almost thought, I think they were already planning to put me to Cebu when I became cardinal. Because one day the nuncio was saying, Ambo, he said, you speak Cebuano, don't you? And that's when, after Archbishop Palma retired from being Archbishop of Cebu, and I said, Charles, I know where the conversation is going. Maybe you think just because I was made cardinal, I'm deserving of an archdiocese, you know. I'm not even archbishop, I'm bishop. I said that maybe I should be transferred to a larger diocese that has always had a cardinal, you know, and all that. I said, there are many good priests in Cebu. He says, why would you have to outsource the leader of the Church of Cebu? So I wasn't saying no, but I was saying it's a bad idea. You know? And if you're doing it only because I was made cardinal, given a red hat by Pope Francis, I don't think that's the reason why Pope Francis made me cardinal. In the first place, when I complained to him why he did not even send me an advance notice before making me cardinal, he said, oh, don't take that too seriously. I mean, there was something really eccentric about Pope Francis, you know. Such a serious thing, and says, don't take that too seriously, you know. And so what I mean, he said, is don't ever get used to being addressed as eminenza. Really, I have goosebumps when people, I don't know why we've gotten so used to titles, holiness, eminence, excellency, reverence, etc., etc. You think Jesus is happy with that? And just by sheer common sense, we say, it's against the spirit of the gospel. We're servants. We're servant leaders. I mean, I have nothing against, oh, father, sister, mother, you know, but excellency, that's too much already, you know. I can still understand when it's an ambassador addressing us because he thinks that's the protocol, you know. And when an ambassador says, Your Excellency, maybe he wants to be addressed Excellency also, you know. It's the common thing. It's the way of the world, but it's not the way of the church. There's so much that is sick in the church. But the good thing is, we have the radical memory of Christ to return to. Aren't you glad that the Gospels were written? Aren't you glad that we have the social teachings of the church, you know, that will bring us back, our feet back on the ground? Yeah. So, that's quite a big contribution that Pope Francis has made, and which Pope Leo is determined to sustain also. But he has to get into, you know, it's like he has inherited a whole system, a whole institution. He cannot just overnight repudiate it. I even raised the question about the wisdom of the dual identity of the Pope. In fact, I raised it to Pope Francis. And then a month later, he made me cardinal. I just said, oh my goodness. I said, because I raised the question during the Synod Assembly. I said, Holy Father, he was there. Have you ever rethought of the wisdom of the dual identity of the Supreme Pontiff of Rome as a political leader, a head of state on the one hand, and a religious leader, a head of the Universal Catholic Church? All the other patriarchs, you know, and heads of churches are not political leaders. It's like only the Pope is a head of a political state. That's why he has a Secretary of State. That's why he has a Curia and people in the Curia who act more like politicians than as pastors. So why do you bewail it? Why do you lament it if it's ingrained in the structure of the Catholic Church to be political? And my brother, you know, the other bishops from Asia, he said, where is that coming from? He said, you dropped the bombshell there. Why? What did you ask that for? I was sincere in asking it. Because look how China is reacting to the Vatican. They would say, you have no right to intrude in the political life of China. Because the Vatican is a political state. You are intruding into our sovereignty. They do not look at the Pope as a religious leader. They look at the Pope as a political leader. And there is a whole overload of history of the politics of the Vatican. We inherited it. But it's like we inherited it and sustain it, but we're not critical of it. It's about time, we started being a bit more critical of ourselves. Just because they're there doesn't mean we'll just maintain it. That's why, I think that's what Pope Francis meant by outgrowing a maintenance church and, growing a more synodal church that is mission-oriented. Because once we have a political agenda, just recently, in my Facebook post, somebody sort of made a comment and said, our politics in this country is hopeless. And we only have hope because of you, Cardinal. Why don't you run for president in 2028? I answered immediately. I said, when religious leaders are made into political leaders, you don't call that democracy, you call it theocracy. And I said, politics is for the lay. Political leadership. When we get into politics, it's more the spirituality and the morals of politics. But from the perspective as spiritual and moral leader. But it can get into our heads. Cardinal Sin was very well-meaning when he called for people power in 1986. But my God, everybody in the world was saying how powerful the Catholic Church is. And then before we knew it, he was getting into politics. At the time, the Gloria Macapagal Arroyo rose to the presidency and Joseph Estrada was ousted, Cardinal Sin and Archbishop Franco, the papal nuncio, went to EDSA and raised the hands of Gloria Macapagal Arroyo as the new president of the Philippines. I mean, what were they thinking? Something's deeply wrong about that. It's saying, this is our anointed president. It's an assertion of power on the church. That is why the temptation story that you listened to last Sunday is very real. Satan knows how to dangle power to us. We have power. Don't you know who you are? You have power. What are you in power for? Use it, It's a common temptation. And it corrupts all missionaries. It corrupts us as a missionary church. So admittedly, there is so much that needs to be corrected, not just in the mentality of the Philippine church, but universal church. But I've always been amazed how differently the Italian church thinks. So there is something very unique, even historically. When I was telling you about Matteo Ricci and Alessandro Valignani, what made them think that way at the time when that was the most unpopular thing to do? They engaged in mission, but differently from the other mode of missionaries. So there is something very unique in what you might want to contribute there, because maybe that's the reason why Rome had to be the center of the universal church. Why, in many ways, the Italian church is graced with something.